The Speak of the Mearns by Grassic Gibbon. When the Romans came marching up into Scotland away far back in the early times, they found it full up of red-headed kerns, with long solemn faces and long sharp swords, who rode into battle in little carts. Chariots they called them, of wicker and wire, things pulled by small ponies, that galloped like polecats, and smelt like the same, scythes on the hubs, and the deeper they marched up through the coarse land, and the less they liked it, the Italian men. And by night they'd sit down inside their camps, and stare at the moving dark outside. Winds and broom, hear the trill of some burn not far off going down through Scotch peats to the sea, and wish to their heathen gods that they'd bidden at home, not wandered up here. And the next morning they'd dig some more at the camp, and pile up great walls, and set up a mound, and mislay a handful or so of pennies, and a couple of bracelets, and a chamber pot to please the learned of later times, and sign scratch their black Italian heads, and make up their minds to push further north. Well, the further they got up beyond the lowlands, the wilder and coarser the wetlands turned. The Caledonians had wasted the country and burned their crops and hidden their goats far up in the eyries. Even some their women, for women aren't nearly so valuable as goats. All that you need to breed a fresh woman was a bed and a loan of your neighbour's wife, long-faced and solemn as yourself. So the Romans jabbered at the women when they got and built more camps, and felt homesick for home Rome and its lines of wine shops, till they came in the lower of a wet autumn day up in through the forest of warfare. Dark pines lining the dripping hills in a sweat, and saw below them the how of the Mearns, a long dreich march that went on, and was sometimes a loch, and sometimes a bog. The mountains towered north, snow on their heights eastwards, beyond a ledge of more hills came the grumble, and southwards girn of the sea, their creesh into the red Mearns clay, as it well became the lowly born pointed by God to serve the gentry. By then the long how was drying up. Here and there some little tenant of the Lord's would push out a finger of corn in the swamps, and dry and drain and sweat through a lifetime, clearing the winds and the twined bog roots, working his wife and bairns to the bone. They'd not complain there wasn't time from morn to night. The fight would go on, and the end of a lifetime or thereabouts. Another 3 acres would be hove from the marsh, and a man would be easing his galluses, crinkled and bent and half blind, and just be ready to go on a slow stroll and take a look at the work of his life, and the canny Mearns lairds would come riding up. "Boy, you've been reclaiming land here," and the tenant would give them a glare. "Aye, and then you know that all lands reclaimed in this area belongs to the manor." And the tenant, if he had any wisdom left from the grind and shave of his sweating day, would agree to that peaceful and pay more rent. If he didn't, he was chased from the land he held, and hounded south and out of the country, maybe strayed to Fife, and was seized on there and held a slave in the Fifeshire mines, toiling naked, him and his wife and bairns unpaid, unholidayed in the long half dark. For that was the age of God and King, when Scotland still had her nationhood, and here and there a village rose, with a winding street and a line of huts, each fronted by a bonny midden pile. Along the coastline St. Cyrus, John's Haven, Bervie Stonehaven's middens, the highest and thickest in the days of the Spanish Armada. A lone and battered ship of that fleet crept up the north coast on a foggy night. The Santa Katerina, battered and torn, and maybe she'd have escaped to her home, and her crew got back to their ordinary work of selling onions up and down the streets, but that she came within smell of Stonehaven, and sank like a stone with all hands complete. But about the time of the killing time, the castle of Dunnottar was laid siege by the English men of that creature Cromwell came up, him that had warts on his nose and his conscience, and planted great bombards against Dunnottar, where the crown and the sceptre of Scotland were hidden. And George Ogilvy was the child in command. He said he wouldn't surrender, not him, for the heavens fell and the seas should yawn. He was ready to sacrifice his men, the castle, the land, Kinniff itself, rather than yield an inch to Cromwell and the English. Aye, soft-headed by nature, prigged at him to yield. They didn't want blood, only the crown and the sceptre, that was all. But while they were prigging, he'd those fairlies lifted and carted off to another place. The minister's wife, Mrs. Granger, hid them, carting them off in the hush of one night to the headland of the How. Soft lap lap went the sea in the dusk as she rowed the boat in under a crumbling wall, and ruined dyke lone and pale in the light of the moon. Here Maiden Castle once had arisen, and as she climbed up the eerie track and over the long deserted walls, something moved queer in her heart. At the sight she turned and looked from the walls to the sea and the moon sinking low and wan, and made up her mind she would mind that place till the time she died. She did the minding before that came. The English grew tired of besieging Dunnottar, and brought up their bombards and trained them and fired them, and John Ogilvy gave a skirl of fear and surrendered at once, and the English came in and ransacked Dunnottar from top to bottom. Not a trace of the regalia stuff, and not a trace had any for years, till the Restoration came, and the King and the Grangers howked the regalia stuff from the place where it lay under the floor of the kirk, and where they came to ask for reward. Mrs. Granger asked that she might have the land where Maiden Castle stood by the sea. Now the Granger woman had been a Stratton, she was big and bony, with black thick hair, a bit like a horse, only not so bonny, and she planned to settle her goods and grant in Maiden Castle, could they get it rebuilt, and plough up the tough land on the landward side, and get him to do a bit of fishing, or smuggling, or stealing, or a bit of pirating, and keep himself in an honest way. So with the little she'd saved in her life, her man the minister, a fusionless old gape, mooning and dreaming and thinking of God and rubbish like that, instead of getting on, she set up granting Maiden Castle. They built a fine Scotch farmhouse, half that and half a laird's hall it was, and Grant she had alter his name to Stratton, and there was laid the beginning of folk who sweated 300 years in that parish doons, and well spoken, if maybe a bit daft, the littlest of lairds in change and Kinniff. They would lift their heads as the years and the generations went by, and the sea changes and plenty come on the land. It broadened out from the old narrow strips into the long parks, for the iron plough horse ploughing came, and at last a road driving betwixt Bervie and Stonehaven filled with the carriages of the gentry folk, and here and there a new farm would rise to spoil the lands of the little crofters. And by then Kinniff had 2 kirks of its own, and a schoolhouse, and a reputation as a home for lairds, so black it would have made a white mark on charcoal. Stonehaven had grown the county town, a long drake place built up a hill, below the sea in a frothing bay, creaming, and it had a fair bairn of folk in it by then. Bigger it had grown than any other Mearns place, even Lawrence Kirk, with its trade and its boasting. And a Stonehaven man would say to a Lawrence Kirk man, "Have you got a provost in Lawrence Kirk, man?" And the Lawrence Kirk child would say, "Aye, that we have, and he's chains." And the Stonehaven gripe would give a bit sniff. "Faith has he so, ours runs around loose." Burvey had mills and spinners by then, when the 1880s opened up, and it was fell radical and full up of suitors ready to brain you with a mallet or devil if you spoke a word against that old tyke Gladstone. It lay back from the sea in a little curve that wasn't a bay, and wasn't straight coast. In winter storms the sea would come up frothing and gurling voice out his front door and nearly swamped the man setting his fire with the speeches of Gladstone grabbed in one hand and Ingersoll under his other oxter. Now these were nearly the only towns that the folk of the How held traffic with. They'd drive to them with the carts for the market, cattle for sale, and bonny fat pigs, grain in the winter, horses ploughing through drifts, and loads of this and that farm produce. And outside it all was an Antrim world full of coarse folk from the north and south.